Today, we're going to break down what seems like a pretty classic neighborhood dispute, a homeowner taking on their HOA over a parking rule. But trust me, this case takes a wild turn that teaches a huge lesson about how the law really works. So, let's get into it.
You know, it's a question a lot of us have probably wondered about. If there's a rule in the books but nobody's enforced it for years and years, can the board just wake up one day and decide to start handing out violations? Well, that is the exact question at the very heart of the story we're looking at today.
All right, so let's meet our players. In one corner, we have the homeowner Wendy Ellsworth, and in the other corner, we have the Vincenz Homeowners Association, or the VHA. The entire fight is over parking on the streets in their community.
Now, the rule itself is about as clear as it gets. It's right there in the community documents. It basically says you can't park your car on any roadway. You have to use your garage, your driveway, or a spot the board has specifically designated for parking. Pretty simple, right? No parking on the street.
Okay, so let's look at this from Ms. Ellsworth's side. Her argument, on the surface, makes a ton of sense. She wasn't really debating whether the rule existed. Her whole point was about the HOA's long history of just not enforcing it.
And this wasn't just a feeling she had. Her actual legal petition claimed that violations of this no street parking rule had been frequent since the neighborhood was first built. Her point was simple. For years, the HOA had just looked the other way.
And her entire case was built on this one legal idea called waiver. It's actually a pretty simple concept. If you have a right, like the right to enforce a rule, but you just never ever use that right, the law might say you've given it up. You've waived it. You know, use it or lose it. So Ms. Ellsworth was arguing the HOA had lost its right to enforce the parking ban. Seems logical, doesn't it?
So this is where the story gets really weird. You'd expect the HOA to come back swinging, right? Maybe show records of them enforcing the rule, or argue about how many violations there really were. But they didn't do that. In fact, they didn't talk about parking at all.
And this slide just perfectly shows the total disconnect here. It's like they were having two completely different conversations. Ms. Ellsworth is saying, you waived your right to enforce the parking rule. And the HOA's response was basically, should we even be in this courtroom? They were arguing about whether the court itself had any power to make a decision in the first place.
And that defense, as bizarre as it sounds, was the killer move. It was the thing that decided the entire case. It completely shifted the focus from cars parked on the curb to a really fundamental, and for the homeowner, fatal, principle of law.
And that principle is called jurisdiction. It's a fancy word for a simple idea, a court's legal power to even hear a case. The analogy here is just perfect. You can have a totally legitimate request for a hamburger, but if you walk into a post office and try to order one, you're just in the wrong place. They don't have the authority to give you a hamburger.
So let's walk through exactly how this played out, because this is where the homeowner's case completely unraveled. First, the specific court she went to can only handle cases where an HOA is accused of breaking one of its own rules. Second, Ms. Ellsworth never said the HOA itself parked a car illegally. What she was actually asking for was something called a declaratory judgment. She wanted the court to declare that the HOA couldn't enforce the rule in the future. And there's the big problem. This particular court, just like the post office with the hamburger, doesn't have the power to do that. It just wasn't on their menu.
And because of that one single procedural mistake, her entire case just collapsed. It didn't matter how right she might have been about the parking. She had brought her very logical argument to the wrong legal address.
So the final verdict was short, and it was brutal. Petition dismissed. All that time, all that effort, all those completely logical arguments tossed out. Not because she was wrong, but because she was in the wrong venue. So here's the real kicker. The most important takeaway from all of this. The court never actually decided the main question. We still don't have an official answer on whether the HOA had waived its right to enforce the parking rule. The whole thing was decided on a technicality. It just goes to show you that in the legal world, how you argue and where you argue can be a million times more important than what you're arguing about. Getting the procedure right is hurdle number one.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. When you get into a dispute, maybe the first question you should ask isn't, am I right or how can I prove my point? Based on this case, the first and most crucial question you have to ask is, am I in the right room?